this video I'm going to cover the game between Jorden van Foreest and Praggnanandhaa. And let's get to the game. So we had e4 and Pragg chose to play c5. We had knight f3, knight c6, and now on the move 3 Van Foreest chose to somehow surprise his opponent. He played bishop c4, which is not so often seen in the top level practice. And black here really naturally plays e6, trying to neutralize this bishop on c4. Now white just castles, and black goes for d5 immediately. And with a bit of delay, he plays bishop b5 here, trying to somehow ruin the pawn structure of black. And I think that here perfectly fine was to play bishop d7 for black, but Pragg chose to play d4. Taking the pawn, why not? Now Van Foreest plays knight e5, trying to pin this knight and also to capture some material. Pragg decided to go queen c7, and now after a couple of exchanges he goes back to c4, but now you can see that those pawns are somewhat ruined. Black has two pairs of double pawns, and really this extra pawn is not something scary for white. Black decides to finish development with bishop d6, and now king h1. This is a very clever move because after bishop h2 now g3 will be played and the bishop is just trapped. So after king h1, black just decides to develop. White does the same, knight c3, and now e5, and now white has to somehow include his bishop from c1 into the play. And how to do that? You have to eliminate the e4 pawn, because if you try to attack the e4 pawn by some piece like queen e2, then black has bishop f5. You cannot include your bishop. So Van Foreest chose here to play f3 to open up some files, and after the pawn moves, then to play d3 and to open up the bishop to get to g5 or something similar. Here Pragg took on f3, queen takes, and now he castled. Van Foreest chose to play d3 like I said, and here he made a very strange choice. He decided to play bishop e6 here. On one hand it's a really strange choice, but on the other it's a very natural move. What do I mean by that? Well, it's strange because he's just ruining his pawn structure forever by doubling his pawns one more time. And what's so natural about this move is that bishop on c4 is very unpleasant in black's position. So black just wants to eliminate this bishop at any cost. In this case, the cost of 4 weak pawns, 2 pairs of double pawns. And Van Foreest took on e6, takes, and bishop g5. White completes his development, and now black will have some issues with his pawn structure. He always has to be careful about some moves like queen h3 or knight e4. The e4 square is a very good outpost for white pieces, so black is here playing only for a draw. I think that it's not realistic to play for something more than draw. And black tries to regroup by queen d7, and here Van Foreest took on f6. Here and knight e4. Black decides here to play f5, a very committal move. I mean, black in some way fixed his pawn structure, but still he has those double pawns. Just now this f pawn is included in this pawn chain. And Van Foreest took on d6, queen d6, and now he is hitting the e5 pawn. The next move should be something like queen e3 or queen g3. Just hitting on e5 and continuing pressure on remaining weak pawns, c5 and d6. So black wanted to include somehow this rook into defending the pawn on e5 by f4, and now this allows the e4 outpost for the rook. A very comfortable play by white. Now black tries to somehow create counterplay by rook b8 and rook b4, trying to exchange some pieces. b4 and now rook b4. Black's dream is to get somehow the queen endgame, but in this case it's not possible without losing too many pawns, because the other rook has to defend from f5 and these rooks are not so easy to exchange. Now Van Foreest plays rook fe1, rook f5, and now queen e2, forcing the trade of rooks because now the e5 is under lots of pressure. So he takes, and now first queen g4, king h8, and now rook e4. Black is really passive in this position, and mainly because of his weaknesses in the center and on the flank. But he could have gone pretty solid with queen f8, and he could have kept the composure of the position. White also doesn't have many resources to attack these pawns on e5 and c5, and also he has some counterplay chances with f3 now. So this was the best chance to make the game more interesting. But here he chose a different way. He chose to play f3 immediately. White has to capture, because otherwise black would either push or take on g2, so gf3 was really natural. And after queen f8, now I like this move very much, queen g3. And now if rook takes f3, there's queen e5, capturing the pawn, and black's king would be in danger. After queen g3, he goes for h6. And now white doesn't capture on e5 because of rook f3, and now there's no check on e5. And rook f1 is coming next with a very dangerous situation for white. So first he goes king g2, knowing that he can always cover his queen with rook g4. So black defends the pawn by queen f6, rook g4, and now king h7, getting away from any checks on g8. And here white tries to get the rook endgame, having these fabulous pawns on the queen side and in the center. Pragg chose to enter this rook endgame. I think that here it was better just to not enter this endgame by playing queen f7, remaining some pressure on f3. Black took on h4, and now we have a rook endgame in which you have these awful pawns. Rook takes, and now rook f4. If he takes and now ef happens, now this pawn endgame is a draw, because if white tries from this side, there is h5 making a blockade, and after this just king g6 and you cannot get to g5. So after this, if you go around here, then he always has counterplay with king g6, king h5. If white goes to f2, then black always has this annoying idea of getting to the king side, and white cannot do anything because the h-pawn would be just too fast. Instead of capturing on f4, he goes for rook g4. Now he's cutting off the king, and also he's offering a trade on his own terms. He wants to straighten his pawns. For example, if black takes, now we have 2 against 1 on the king side, and the king can just march, capture all these weak pawns, and win the game. So Pragg chose to play h5 here. Foreest doesn't capture on f4 again, and now he plays rook f5. And here the question is, does white take on f5 or not? Is it good for him? Foreest chose not to take it. He went back to g3, but he could have taken on f5, and after ef to play f4. If he doesn't do that on time, then black plays f4 himself, and then he always has this idea of entering the king side. If h4 happens, now black plays f4, doesn't allow f4 anymore, and after king f2, king g6, king e2, king f6, going to the queen side like this. There's king d5, because if you go king d6, then you allow king to get to c4. Now black just runs out of tempi. a6, white plays a3, a5, he goes a4, and he also has a spare tempo of c3, which is ridiculous. So he goes to d5, and now in case of a3, to go a6, and in case of a4, to go a5. And now white has to step away to d2 or b2, and it's a draw. And after a6 here, if he goes b4, this could be a problem for white, because if black captures on b4, now if ab, then c5. And now there's this passed pawn on the a file. And now the king enters the stage. And now here I'm not sure if this could work out. If c4, king d3, c5, e4, I think this works out actually, because after this you don't capture because here f2, queen, queen, but you have this skewer on a6. But instead you just push the pawn. You don't allow skewer. And I think this is okay for black. I think he's even the one who is pushing for the win, because now his king is deep into the white's position and he can easily target those pawns. And I wanted to get to this position to see why b4 doesn't work. After b4, if he takes with the king, then there's king d4 and king gets to e3 and collect this pawn, and I think the f pawn is just too fast. You cannot do much about it. So let's go back a bit. I was trying to prove the point why this exchange was good for white. If e takes, f4 is the only move that wins. And now black takes, king f3, king g6, and king takes f4. And now black can go king f6, white goes h4, and now the point here is to spend tempi of black and then to get to g5 or e5. If he goes to g6 immediately, then there is king e5 and he's losing this pawn on f5. Black has to play a6, and after a4, a5, c3 let's say. If king goes to e6, there's king g5, and after king e5, there is king h5. Now if the pawn moves immediately, then there's king g4, stopping the pawn immediately. But there is also king f4, resourceful move. If king g6, then king g4, and now both pawns promote at the same time. We have this promotion, but in the following queen endgame, black has very good chances. Black is winning, I would say. Queen d3, king f6, and he's going to get slowly to the queen side and collect all these pawns. So this was the chance for Van Foreest to grab a win, I would say instantly, but maybe he was afraid of some blunder that he might have made looking at the distance, because when you look at the variation 15 moves ahead, you might miss something really obvious that you cannot miss when you have it immediately on the board without having to visualize the whole position. But instead he remained in this rook endgame by rook g3, and now rook f4 again. King now gets active by king f2, rook goes back to f7, and now rook g5 again. And black is forced to defend this pawn by rook f5, and again Van Foreest doesn't capture on f5, he goes back to g1. He is ready to get his king to e3, to e4, and then to grab these pawns in the center. Look at black's position. The rook alone cannot do much, so he wanted to make some counterplay by playing c4. Here Jorden plays dc4. I think the better choice was to capture with the b pawn, because after bc the point was that after e4 black wanted to play this, but anyways it doesn't work, because after this now he's going to capture on a2 or c4, so white has to get closer to e3 to these pawns, and after rook a2 to go king d3 and now start pushing the pawn. So this was maybe the better way to go. Even with dc he doesn't ruin his chances to win. Black has e4, now rook g3 to defend the pawn, and now h4, making this rook a bit passive now, forcing the rook to go to h3 to keep defending the pawn on f3, and now allowing the king to get closer to get out of this jail he was in on the h file. Now king e3 by white, and now black is forced to capture. Rook f3, and now white is a pawn up. Also the structure is somewhat ruined, so it's really tough to hold this position. The only hope is that black has this e-pass pawn, but that also means that white has lots of pawns on the other side, 4 against 2 on the queen side. Now white plays a4, rook e5, and now king d3. White's ready now to push those pawns with b4, b5, and creating some path pawns. And now rook g5, Maybe it was more resilient to go rook e1, but even after that, rook e3 was good, and after rook d1, king c3, now white starts pushing these pawns. And even if black manages to somehow push this pawn, then those pawns are also going to run very fast. Let me show you one variation which could have happened if this was played. White plays b4, let's say, e5, and now b5. Now, if c5 happens, I think that there is rook d3 with rook d5 next. Capturing this pawn and having a mass of white pawns, it's possible even to sacrifice the rook for this pawn on e5. So if black takes on b5, it doesn't change much. These pawns are really fast, really dangerous. And if e4 happens, c5, king f4, now white plays c6. He gives up the rook, and the rook has to go to d8 to stop this c pawn. And after rook e1, e3, king b4. Now the c pawn is just going to run, create another fast pawn on b6, and the rook cannot do anything about it. White's rook is going to sacrifice for the e pawn, and that's it. Instead of rook e1, he plays rook g5. And now white starts pushing his pawns on the queen side, rook g1, but now b5. He tries somehow to block these pawns by c5, but there is a pawn as well. Rook d1, king e4, rook d4. Now he takes one pawn, but it doesn't matter because there is a b passed pawn. After b6, takes. Now rook b4 doesn't do much because of rook b3, offering the trade, and the king is too far from the b pawn. So black takes on c2, but now white has rook b3, supporting this pawn to push forwards. And now black plays c4. White remains on the b file by playing rook b1, and now c3, b7, and after rook e2, king d4, and the last chance for black was to play c2, but now white gives a simple check. And in this position, Praggnanandhaa resigned because white's going to promote in the next move, and it's impossible to do anything about it. And see you soon. Bye.